Check. Thank you. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it. All right. Well, good evening, and thank you for joining us. Before I begin with a few introductory remarks, I've been asked to encourage people to move a little farther down front if you can. It's much more enjoyable down front, I think. You'll get more out of the experience. So just wanted to take a minute to encourage folks to move down front if you wish. I think you'll enjoy the lecture more if you do. Anyway, thank you all. Thank you all very much for joining us for the inaugural event for the Johnson Colloquium Lecture Series. I'm Dr. Rusty Jones. I'm the chair of the Department of English and Philosophy, and I am pleased to welcome you to our beautifully renovated historic Lovett Auditorium, and we are fortunate to have a wonderful speaker with us tonight. But before I introduce him, I'd like to thank a few of the people who made his presence possible. So first, I'd like to thank Dr. Charles Johnson. Dr. Johnson and his wife, the late Marlene Johnson, established this colloquium series to ensure that Lovett Auditorium would always be a cultural hub for our community, featuring a robust slate of guest speakers, visiting artists, musicians, and academic experts. As chair of the Murray Shakespeare Festival, I am so proud to partner with the Colloquium Series for tonight's special event. So thank you very much, Dr. Johnson, for all you've done to support our university, our students, and this beautiful space. Would you all please join me in thanking Dr. Johnson, who is here tonight with his daughters Gina and Lisa, for their generous support. So thank you, Dr. Johnson. Thank you. And second, speaking of the Murray Shakespeare Festival, shameless plug, which will take place March 6th through the 9th in this wonderful space, I would also like to sincerely thank Murray State University distinguished alumna Nancy Gibbs Becker. Mrs. Becker has been the primary supporter of the Murray Shakespeare Festival for quite some time, and it is through her generosity that thousands of regional students from elementary school through high school have seen the works of Shakespeare performed by professionals on this stage. Mrs. Becker, thank you for promoting the arts in our region, for inspiring young people to learn and to love Shakespeare, and for making tonight's lecture possible. So please join me in thanking Mrs. Becker. And finally, speaking of tonight's lecture, you are in for a treat. I'm very pleased to introduce the 2024 Johnson Colloquium Series speaker, Dr. Joseph Luzzi. Dr. Luzzi received his PhD from Yale University and is the Asher B. Edelman Professor of Literature at Bard College, where he also teaches courses on film and Italian studies. He is the founder of the Virtual Book Club, an international online community devoted to exploring some of the best books ever written, and he's the author of 5 award-winning books himself, one of which is on sale in the lobby tonight. So I hope you can avail yourself of that. Dr. Luzzi's, I didn't introduce the book. His most recent work, Botticelli's Secret, The Lost Drawings and the Rediscovery of the Renaissance, is the book that is on sale in the lobby following the event. And Dr. Luzzi's public lectures have inspired and delighted audiences worldwide. And tonight, his lecture, entitled The Plays, the Things, Shakespeare's Poetics and Our World Today, uses Shakespeare's works as a means to explore and to illuminate the most essential components of the human condition. So again, please join me in welcoming Dr. Joseph Luzzi.
Thank you all. How's the sound? Great. Thank you to Dr. Jones for that very generous introduction, and a warmest thanks as well, just to echo what Dr. Jones said. I'm very grateful to Dr. Johnson for this invitation. It's an incredible honor. To my dear friend, Mrs. Nancy Becker, it's so wonderful to be reunited in this format here, and to Kayla Allen Dunn, who is such a wonderful host today, showing me around this area. I'm grateful. Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here. It's really exciting to be here, and a little nerve-wracking, I have to say. This is one of the larger venues I've spoken in. I'm doubly excited because this talk that I'm giving tonight is part of a book that I've been trying to write for years, and I have struggled with, to be honest with you. I've been trying to write a book about literature, why we need literature, why we need great literature, and what it can do for us, both as people and in a communal sense. And as you can imagine, that's such a broad topic that one could get lost in it. So I have my kind of entry point to it, And my entry point is an idea that goes back to Aristotle about the power of literature. Aristotle said very famously in his Poetics, he said, history gives us the specific, the contingent. It tells us what happened. He said literature, poetry, creates these imaginative universals, what could be, what should be, so that literature is a form of truth-telling through the make-believe. And it's a very profound statement by Aristotle, and I think it's one that really represents Shakespeare at his best. So what I want to do tonight is talk to you about how for Shakespeare, the literary imagination, which he often translates into metaphors relating to the theater, obviously enough, becomes a way to discover things that reality hides. And that some of the characters are good at it, and some of the characters aren't so good at it. So we have comedies and we have tragedies. And part of the tragic in Shakespeare, I want to argue, is these characters who don't fully understand the potential of the creative imagination. And there's a breakdown of the imagination at a key moment, and the consequences are fatal. So that's basically what I want to sort of put on the table for you today. Now, I realize not everyone in here is a Shakespeare expert, and this talk is not geared towards experts. I'm also going to introduce Shakespeare and do my best to give you a sort of general sense of some of the important things about Shakespeare to give you some traction for the argument that I'm going to make. Okay? Wonderful. So I'll jump right in. And the first thing I'll say is, you know, Shakespeare is, there we go. Phew, okay. Shakespeare is one of those names, I always tell my students, it's like, in a way, he's too famous. It's like they think of him as a statue, the Shakespeare statue. You know, you've got to bow down and genuflect before the Shakespeare statue because it's such an enormous, his reputation is so extraordinary, and his, you know, you feel you have to kind of know him inside out. The reality is Shakespeare is, I always tell my students, was an incredible risk taker. And he didn't have a fancy education. That's why a lot of people don't think that Shakespeare was actually Shakespeare, because some people say, you know, how could someone who just had a high school education write all those great plays? Well, he did write them, and all serious Shakespeare scholars believe that he was actually the person that wrote them. But I like what Emerson said. You know, Emerson said, William Shakespeare is the only biographer of Shakespeare. Just read his works. That's really the best way to understand who Shakespeare was, because he created such an incredible body of work, and you can read about his passions, the things that meant to him. It's all there in his plays. And remember, you know, Shakespeare was a great businessman. He filled theaters like this. He died a very wealthy man. He had one of the biggest houses in Stratford-upon-Avon. He wasn't someone who lived an ivory tower life. I want you to think of Shakespeare as someone who, you know, had everyday concerns and needs and just happened to be this incredibly gifted playwright. He represents the English Renaissance. And if you think about that term, you know, the Renaissance in Italy happens in the 1300s. Shakespeare's writing in the late 1500s and in the early 1600s. So you get a sense that the Renaissance is such a capacious term, and it's happening in different countries at different times, but that Shakespeare really is at the heart of that English Renaissance. And, you know, lest we get too serious about him, remember, he's also part of popular culture. There's Shakespeare in the Park, and then there's just Shakespeare in the Way, blocking your entrance to the subway. Shakespeare in the Way. How about Hamlet's duplex? To be or not to be? And my favorite, Hamlet versus Amazon Prime. To buy or not to buy, that is a question. Definitely nobler to shop locally, and yet free shipping. You know, these dilemmas. Actually, the next one is my favorite. The witches of Macbeth discover the wok. Double, trouble and toil, fried up in peanut oil, water chestnut, eye of newt, wing of bat, and bamboo shoot. these are playful cartoons, but they show you how Shakespeare has become part of, our everyday. He invented up to a couple thousand words. The first use of a couple thousand words in the English language go back to Shakespeare. There's just so many firsts you can associate him. And let's not forget, he's also part of, American popular culture. What astonishes me about Shakespeare and really kind of keeps me up is this incredible period of productivity he experienced that I just think defies the imagination. He's born in 1564, okay? So by 1600, he's only 36 years old, all right? He's already had quite a career. He's written Romeo and Juliet, 1594 to 1597. He's written A Midsummer Night's Dream, works that already would have guaranteed someone's reputation. But then something happens around 1600 that changes the history of literature forever. 1600, Hamlet. 1600 to 1602, Twelfth Night, one of my favorite plays. 1601, All's Well That Ends Well. 1603, Othello. 1605, King Lear. 1606, Macbeth. How is that possible? How is that possible that one person has this vein of productivity that is just so cataclysmic? Of course, we can't really explain that. I can tell you, though, that the wonder years, as I call them, they do have certain things in common. This is the years where Shakespeare writes his great tragedies, okay? It's also the years that he kind of throws the rule book out. He doesn't follow the Aristotelian unities of time, place, and action the way a playwright is supposed to do. Hamlet, these plays are sprawling. There's no rules, no playbook. He follows his instincts, and he created these remarkable works. This is what I'm going to focus on this evening. I want to talk about three of the tragedies. I want to talk about Hamlet, I want to talk about Othello, and King Lear through a very specific lens. But I just want you to absorb this for a second, these years of productivity where genius just kept pouring out of him. Unstoppable. And he retires 2 years after that. Basically, his last play is The Tempest around 1609. He's barely 50 years old. He's in his late 40s. He walks away from the theater. Maybe he felt he had nothing more to give or to create. So how did he get there? Harold Bloom, the great Shakespeare scholar, talks about Shakespeare's invention of the human. He says, in lesser writers, characters unfold. In Shakespeare, they develop. By that he meant you can feel them coming alive on the page. They're so complicated. They're so textured. They're so nuanced. There's something. And Bloom says, you want to understand the psychology, the Oedipal complex, don't read Sigmund Freud, read Shakespeare. And I think he's right. How about when Hamlet says to his mom, he yells at her, he says, "Nay, but to live in the rank sweat of an enseamed bed, stewed in corruption, honeying and making love over the nasty sty." That dramatic moment when Hamlet calls out Gertrude for having married Claudius so soon after the death of her husband. Bloom says that this is a kind of proto-Oedipal moment. Who knows? I wouldn't bet against it. But there is something that Bloom says that I want to pick up on, this idea of cognition. I think for Shakespeare, the argument that I want to make is that the theater becomes more than just a form of entertainment, but it becomes a mode of cognition, a way of thinking. He uses the theater to think through, irrationally, because it's the make-believe, rational problems. Okay, so just file that away. Everything in Shakespeare's language, Lady Macbeth talks about being unsexed. "Come, you spirits that bend on mortal thoughts, unsex me here." There's a dialogue in Shakespeare between this incredible rhetoric, but then also these moments of transparency. And I want you to keep this in mind as well, where the characters seem to be speaking from the heart. When Juliet, in the famous orchard scene, I remember Bloom used to talk about this in class, when he would say, listen to her words, there's no rhetoric in them. When she says to Romeo, but to be frank and give it to thee again. And yet I wish but for the thing I have. My bounty is as boundless as the sea. Just right from the heart. No rhetoric, no fancy language. This is the kind of, on the one hand, Shakespeare can be incredibly artificial with language. On the other hand, very simple, okay? And I think his genius is accessible, okay? That's why he sold so many seats. That's why he became very famous. But I want you to remember something. Shakespeare wasn't beloved by everybody. A lot of people thought he was too much of a rule breaker. Voltaire, the great French critic, said, he called Shakespeare those monstrous farces called tragedies. He called Shakespeare a drunken savage. How about that? Because Shakespeare did not follow the traditional rules. I want you to keep that in mind. So when you're reading him, think about someone who there was no playbook, that he was writing really in his own style. And he did so in a way, and I think that's what makes him so universal. He creates these archetypes, the grieving children, the ambitious Macbeth, the romantic teenagers. That's why Shakespeare's been staged in so many different places, in Manhattan, in Stalin's Gulag, Blenheim Palace, and the adaptations will keep going on and on. There's something very adaptable about his plays, that universality. How did he get to be universal? Before I jump into my argument, I just want to give you 4 keys to Shakespeare that have helped me, and maybe they can help you read him, okay? The first key is this. Remember, in Shakespeare, it's all in the language. He wasn't like Milton or Dante. He wasn't a scholar. He wasn't, citing things where you had to look through 8 pages of footnotes. Romeo and Juliet was a short story by an Italian writer, a very boring one that he made into a great play. All of his stuff he took from sources. He adapted. Hamlet was taken from history books. Othello, pretty much everything Shakespeare wrote was an adaptation of an existing source. So think about that. It's all in the language. And here's a case where it shows you how the language works. Do you remember when Hamlet is introduced? Claudius is saying, in that case, leave when you like, Laertes, and spend your time however you wish. I hereby grant your request and hope you have a good time. And now, Hamlet, my nephew and my son. That doesn't sound right, does it? What he says about Gertrude, my sometime sister and now my queen. That rhetoric of incest, it's creepy, it's weird. My nephew and my son. Something really is rotten in the state of Denmark. And listen to what Hamlet says. A little more than kin and less than kind. Too close of a family member and no friend of mine. And it's all in that wordplay. You just have to read the language. And if you look at the etymology of kin, which means family, and kind, gentility, they all go back to the same root in Anglo-Saxon for familiarity, familial bond. And Shakespeare is able to riff on that, to kind of give you the essence of the character. Form and content are one in him. The second thing I would say is, I always tell my students, literature at its best is like a fossil that a dinosaur leaves. It gives you a record of how some people lived and thought. It's make-believe, and yet there's something real about it. Think of Cordelia's speech. Remember I gave you Juliet's speech. My bounty is my love is as bountiful, is as boundless as the sea. When Lear challenges Cordelia, and she just speaks the truth, there's no rhetoric in these words either. Unhappy that I am, I cannot heave my heart into my mouth. I love your majesty according to my bond, no more, no less. We'll just leave it at that. Absolute absence of rhetoric, transparency. And it will cost Cordelia her life because the other sisters are dupe the father. But you can almost hear here that kind of transparency, that record of how someone thought and felt. And Shakespeare's so brilliant at that. My third key is, he's aware of what he can do with literature. He's aware what he can do with language. There's that famous scene when Prospero in The Tempest says goodbye, and he says, "Release me from my bands with the help of your good hands. Gentle breath of your sails must fill, or else my project fails, which was to please. Now I want spirits to enforce, art to enchant, and my ending is despair, unless I be relieved by prayer, which pierces so that it assaults mercy itself and frees all faults. As you from crimes would pardon be, let your indulgence set me free." He's basically saying, please let me retire. I want to walk away. But he noticed that his last words are as a magician almost, knowing what he had done with language. He knew he was a magician of language and is sort of retiring his wand / his pen. So all of these are keys to Shakespeare. You know, the form is content, this ability to go inside the human heart, this understanding of the power, almost the spellbinding powers of literature. The one that I want to focus on tonight for my talk is what I call theater as cognition, using theater to think. Okay, there's so many meta-theatrical moments in Shakespeare. Okay, there's this charming scene in Midsummer Night's Dream. First, good Peter Quint, say what the play treats on, then read the names of the actors and so grow to a point. Mary, our play is the most lamentable comedy and most cruel death of Pyramus and Thisbe. It's playful, it's fun, it's a play within a play, and we get all that often in Shakespeare, to be sure. But then, you know, there's moments where it's more than just playful, where I think it's about discovery. And I want to go back to that quote from Aristotle that I made you earlier. This is a famous painting, famous Italian painting. It's Raphael's School of Athens. It's in the Vatican. Some of you may have seen it in person. And at the very center of it are the two, this is sort of all the great thinkers of antiquity. And at the very center of it, there's Plato on the left and Aristotle on the right. And this is a close-up of it. And Plato, the great Greek philosopher, is pointing up. And he's saying, you know, humans are so limited, dear Aristotle. They only see the reflections on the cave, the surface of the cave wall. They can't know reality. They can't know true philosophy. Only the philosopher can send his thoughts heavenward, right? To know the truth. And then Aristotle is pointing down. He's the scientist. He's saying, yes, Plato, humans are flawed, we're frail, but we can observe things too, and we can use our mind rationally to find genuine discoveries. And I don't think it's coincidental that the patron saint of literature is Aristotle, not Plato. Remember what Plato wanted to do with the poets? He banned them from his ideal republic because they told falsehoods. They made stuff up. I don't think he understood poetry. Listen to what Aristotle says about the poets. Fictions can be as powerful as histories, revealing the people to themselves, allowing them to understand their own natures and the natures of those around them, and making them real. This was the paradox of the whispered stories, okay? And actually, that's a quote from Salman Rushdie, what I was going to read later. But it's basically repeating Aristotle, and I'll give you the Aristotle quote. Poetry is something more philosophical and of graver import than history, since its statements are of the nature of universals, whereas those of histories are singulars. By a universal statement, I mean one as to which such a kind of man will probably or necessarily say or do. That is the aim of poetry, though it affixes proper names to characters by a singular statement as to what, say, Alcibiades did or had done to him. He's basically saying that with fiction, with poetry, you create these laboratories of reality. You explore reality through the make-believe, that you're making things up, but you're doing so in a way to find the truth. Let me give you an example. Have you read The Great Gatsby, some of you? Some of you have. I mean, it's a made-up book about the 1920s Prohibition, but where would you get a better sense of the zeitgeist of the 1920s, you know, of the jazz age? As fictional as it is, Fitzgerald thought of himself as an historian. Maybe you've read To Kill a Mockingbird. some of you. Think of that. That is a fictional story that is bringing you inside the legacy of slavery in the South, racism, and all these terrible things that America struggles with today. It's dealing with it in fictional terms, but it's helping you understand the truth. It's what I think is the DNA of literature, that literature at its best is a kind of laboratory for testing the real. And, you know, it's the opposite of fake news. Fake news pretends it's real and leads you to something false, whereas literature states its make-believe on the surface and brings you to that real. And I think Shakespeare was very aware of that. I think he was very aware of that. And that's the argument that I want to make in the time that I have left. I want to show you how Shakespeare takes that Aristotelian idea and uses the theater to discover the truth when it's hidden, okay? And another way to look at it is like this. Think about trials in literature. You remember the trial in To Kill a Mockingbird? Tom Robinson, a black American, is falsely accused of raping Maya Ewell, and he's innocent. We know he's innocent. In the trial, he's convicted as guilty. But it's almost like the book is holding its own trial of him, you know, a fictional trial where circumstantial evidence doesn't carry the day, where you have to look for the real evidence. Or think of the trial in the Brothers Karamazov, another a wonderful book about a murder trial. The trial itself comes to the wrong verdict because, again, it relies on circumstantial evidence, stuff that seems real but isn't real. And I think Shakespeare does the same thing. I want to talk to you about how he does this in 3 plays. All of these plays have 3 things in common. They're all about the quest for evidence. They're all about a tension between something that seems real and is actually fake. And they all have meta-theatrical components. They all talk about the theater some way, especially Lear and Hamlet. Less so Othello. But I think this Othello one is really important as a kind of negative example of what I'm trying to show. I've always been fascinated in Othello, how such a brilliant man as Othello, okay? We know the story of Othello. It's like the story of this brilliant general who's duped by Iago into this murderous jealousy. He kills his loving wife Desdemona because Iago convinces him that she's unfaithful to him. And she's not. She's totally faithful to him. I've always been fascinated, how can this guy who's a great general, who's very smart, he has this incredible scene, Othello, where he kind of tells the senators how Desdemona fell in love with him because she heard his stories and she felt compassion for them. How could he be so susceptible to Iago? And then I realized it has a lot to do with the way Othello processes evidence, visual evidence. And this play is a lot about seeing, if you think about it, especially seeing Othello. Othello was based on this Moorish ambassador to the Elizabethan court, to the British royal court during the Crusades. So there was the fear of, you know, the Christians were fighting the Moors. The Moor was the non-Christian other. And so that's why we get a lot of racist stereotyping of Othello, okay? But think of how Othello is described visually in this play in outright racist terms. What Iago says when he gets the senators together. He says, even now, very now, an old black ram is topping your white ewe. It's ugly. And he's continually, these comments about Othello's race and looks are made continually. So I think this creates this sort of, this idea of, you know, it destabilizes Othello. His sense of self is compromised a little bit by this endless assault. And so he himself starts to look for evidence, visual cues. And what does he look for? Well, first, before you understand that, I want to talk to you about W.B. Du Bois, a great black American scholar who said, the problem with people who are the victim of racism is that they start to see themselves through the lens of the people who are stereotyping them. There's a veil dividing them from themselves. They have very difficulty seeing themselves who they are because they've been called so many names, they've been negatively stereotyped as this or that. So they start to process that negative energy in their own sense of self. I think this is what happens to Othello. I think at the time when he needs it, this veil is dividing him from real knowledge. And so he reaches out to the unreal. What does he look for? This handkerchief. He's obsessed with this handkerchief. This handkerchief that Iago has said is proof that his wife is cheating on him, right? And remember, Iago is all about the unreal. Iago, he said early in the play, I will wear my heart upon my sleeve for dogs to peck at. I am not what I am. I'm not what you see, Othello. But Othello is stuck on this idea of visual evidence. He needs it. He's holding on to it. By heaven, I saw my handkerchief in's hand. O perjured woman, thou dost stone my heart and makes me call what I intend to do a murder, which I thought a sacrifice. I saw the handkerchief. He sees the handkerchief connected to Desdemona and Cassio, and he thinks it's proof. What is it? Ocular proof. That's what he wants. He wants ocular proof. Villain, be sure thou prove my love a whore. Be sure of it. Give me the ocular proof. Right at the time he needs to have imagination and really think through, he's obsessed with this visual detail, this concrete detail. And it leads him down the wrong path. We know what happens with this obsession with ocular proof. Othello falls tragically for circumstantial evidence. And it leads him, of course, he strangles Desdemona. If you've read the play, it's one of the most unbearable scenes in the history of literature to get through. And it's so unnecessary and awful. And I think it has to do with this breakdown in Othello's imagination to be able to distinguish between the seeming real and the actual real. He's not able to process that. T.S. Eliot said a very brilliant thing about the play. He said, I have always felt that I have never read a more terrible exposure of human weakness, of universal human weakness, than that last great speech of Othello. What Othello seems to me doing in making this speech is cheering himself up. It's kind of when he explains himself. He says, I am one who loved not wisely but too well. It is pretty sad. What Othello, he is endeavoring to escape reality. He has ceased to think about Desdemona. Othello succeeds in turning himself into a pathetic figure by adopting an aesthetic rather than a moral attitude. I think that's right. I think that Othello has a serious breakdown in self-knowledge and the imagination, and it cost Desdemona his life, and it cost him his life. And I think that's part of the tragedy of Othello. And I think it's also what happens in Lear. You could say that Othello is blinded by the seeming real, okay? I want to talk to you about another kind of false evidence in Shakespeare. We talked about visual evidence in Othello. King Lear is about oral evidence, hearing what you think is the truth. Othello thinks he sees the truth, that white handkerchief, but it's not. Lear thinks he hears the truth, and it's not. They're both looking for evidence and misjudging it. And this is so theatrical. Think of that opening scene in King Lear. It's like a bad play. Lear is the director, and he tells his three daughters, go out on stage and tell me in front of everyone, tell the world how much you love me. Basically what he says, right? And what happens? Well, they have this duty that he believes they should do. And two of the girls are, so we can call this Lear as the director, okay? This is the meta-theatrical thing. So Goneril and Regan go out and they just lie, right? What do they say? They say, Sir, I am made of this. Sir, I love thee more than words can wield the matter. Dearer than eyesight, space, and liberty, beloved what can be beyond what can be valued, rich and rare. And then Regan says, I find she names my very deed of love, only she comes too short. This is the opposite of those lines, what I showed you in Juliet, where she was speaking the truth. This is the opposite, of course, of Cordelia, who just speaks the truth, right? Unhappy that I am, I cannot heed my heart into my mouth. I love your majesty according to my bond, no more, no less. So Lear is directing a play, but he's not really understanding his actors at all. The bad actors are Goneril and Regan, and they're just lying through their teeth. The good actor is Cordelia, and he doesn't want to hear what she says because he doesn't like it. He's too vain, he's too blind. So he wants oral evidence of their love for him, but it's completely fake. And we know what happens because of this, right? Think of Juliet when she says to Romeo, swear not by the moon. She knows rhetoric when she hears it, and she doesn't want it. She's like Cordelia. Lear, unfortunately, is incapable of understanding what real oral evidence is. And so he hears the fake and confuses it for the real in this sort of theater-like setting. And who's the fool, right? Lear more than his fool. His fool's actually pretty bright. And we know how it ends. It ends terribly. So Othello is incapable of seeing reality. Lear is incapable of listening to reality. There's a serious tragic breakdown at a key juncture. Now, let's look at our third test case. This is where someone gets it right, who really is a good director within a play and a good actor within a play. Hamlet. Hamlet is, what I call aesthetic evidence. So if we look at Hamlet, I want to read to you something about Hamlet that W.H. Auden said that I think is one of the most brilliant things I've read about the play. W.H. Auden said about Hamlet, he said, Hamlet lacks faith in God and in himself. Consequently, he must define his existence in terms of others. E.g., I am the man whose mother married his uncle who murdered his father. He would like to become the Greek tragic hero, a creature of situation, hence his inability to act. For he can only act, in quotes, i.e., play at possibilities. What Auden's saying is that Hamlet is an actor in his own life. He wants to be the son who can avenge his father's death, but he's too paralyzed by inactivity. He wants to be the soldier who fights for his country, but he's too, he's too intellectual. He wants to be the son who can put his mother in his place, but he's too bound to her. So according to Auden, he's just doomed to playing all these different roles and never really fully inhabiting one. I think there's a lot to that, but I also think that makes Hamlet a brilliant director. And we know what we're talking about, the famous mousetrap. This is the play within a play. And this is really what inspired my talk. I thought of that moment when Shakespeare is looking for proof as well. I mean, Hamlet is looking for proof, right? Othello wants proof, and he looks for it in the white handkerchief. Lear wants proof, and he looks for it in the words of love from his daughters. Hamlet wants proof, and he has a brilliant idea. Reality isn't going to provide that proof. Art will provide that proof. He's going to stage a play. The play's the thing in which I'll catch the conscience of the king. That is that Aristotelian laboratory, that make-believe. Remember, Othello and Lear failed to read the signs of reality. They mistook signs for wonders, as they say in the Bible. They thought it was something important, but it really wasn't. Only Hamlet understands that sometimes you have to use the irrational to get to the rational. And so what does Hamlet do? He brings in the he brings in the performers and he says, he gives them that lecture, which is so wonderful. He says, "Speak the speech, I pray you, as I pronounced it to you, trippingly on the tongue. But if you mouth it, as many of your players do, I had as lief the town overspoke my line. Nor do not saw the air too much with your hand, but use all gently, for in the very torrent tempest, and as I may say, whirlwind of your passion, you must acquire and begin a temperance that may give it a smoothness." He's saying, play it natural. Don't overdo it. Don't overact. And what happens? It's an amazing scene. Claudius, who's guilty as guilty can be, watches the performance, and Hamlet's directing it, and there's his ocular proof. That's what Othello wanted. That's what Lear wanted. That moment of truth. And it was denied them, and it's part of their tragedy that they failed to read the signs of reality correctly. This guy's no fool. He's immoral as they come, but he knows when he's been had, and Hamlet's got him in the trap. There's Othello's ocular proof. But notice what delivered that ocular proof. It was a make-believe play. It wasn't the handkerchief. It wasn't the empty words of love that were fake. Because sometimes in the world, what seems real isn't real. And that's why we have literature. It helps us understand the difference between what's pretending to be real and what's actually real. Hamlet brilliantly is able to coax the guilt out of Claudius through this performance. And there he has his ocular proof. Unfortunately, it's too little too late. And this is where I think Auden is so brilliant. Hamlet is an actor, and there's a world of difference between reality and the stage. I actually think Hamlet's that's the only place in the play he was really at home, directing that play. He just can't. Remember when he sees those soldiers up ahead and he says, for an eggshell, they'd kill you for honor's sake. And me, whose father is, dead in his grave, I can't act, I'm paralyzed. Well, I think that's when we get to the genius of Shakespeare. And, if I sort of were to sum up, this, because Hamlet has these theatrical limits, if I were to sum up the tragic in each of the play, and I think this is where Shakespeare is so transcendentally smart, is that what lifts each of the characters up is what brings them down. Othello is great. Hamlet is great because of his intellectualism, his ability to think through every side of a problem. His mind is extraordinary. He's probably the most psychologically complex character ever created, perhaps. And yet, ultimately, it's like Goethe, the great German critic, said, ultimately, Hamlet was like a vase in which someone planted an oak tree. Sooner or later, the roots were going to expand, and the vase was going to shatter. And that's what you get. The tragedy of Hamlet is that intellectualism ultimately causes paralysis, even though it leads to that great theatrical discovery that we showed. With Othello, the source of his greatness is his soldierliness, his loyalty, that doggedness ultimately becomes tragic. He can't let go. He can't let go of this jealousy, this blindness, and he pursues it with the same zeal that made him such a brilliant military commander. And with Lear, Lear's the great king. Lear is the symbol, vanity, the state, l'état c'est moi, as King Louis XIV used to say. Lear can't let go of that, and ultimately it brings him down. So I think Shakespeare's brilliance is to know that for most of us, our virtues are bound up in our vices. And as I wrap this up, I just have a few closing thoughts. I would say that, when I think of Shakespeare today and the challenges that, and I'd love to open it up for questions afterward. What are the challenges to keep Shakespeare alive today? I think there's the great challenge is, do you read the Shakespearean letter? How do you negotiate that old language, the these and the thous, the doths and the anons, and the marries and the ands? How do you bring them to the present? I will tell you, once you get past the slight barrier of the old-fashioned language, he really is our contemporary. It's so alive and so fresh. It doesn't take that much work to really update Shakespeare to the present. It's really just that linguistic barrier to entry that you can get over without too much work. And once you do that, then you decide if you want to translate Shakespeare, sort of bring him across from his age to his own on his own terms. You love the pageantry of the Renaissance Shakespeare, or you want to adapt it to kind of modern times. Do you want to think of how he would work in the modern world today? That choice is yours. There's a wonderful essay that I give my students. It's about defining literature. It's by Terry Eagleton. And he says, literature there's no intrinsic quality to literature where you would say, that's great literature. It's not fancy writing because, look at Hemingway. We ate well and cheaply and it was good. That's not that fancy, but we consider it literature. It's not make-believe. Look at George Orwell's essays. They're literature, Plato's philosophy, right? He says literature is a value judgment that we give to works that over time have accrued certain value, that they've stood the test of time. And he said, we may come to a world where Shakespeare, whom we think is fixed as fixed could be, may be no more than cultural graffiti. I don't think that's going to happen, but I do think what he says is spot on. These writers will only live if we keep reading them. A writer that I love, Milton, Paradise Lost, it's read less and less, it's studied less and less. I fear it's disappearing. That this happens to works. If it can't just be the college syllabus that keeps these works alive. So I urge you all to kind of give Shakespeare a chance. I don't think you'll regret it. And I'll close with just, I want to read a very short passage from Othello and tell you why I chose it. I grew up my family immigrated from Italy. And so I didn't grow up speaking Shakespearean language, far from it. In fact, this is my family in Italy, in Calabria in the 1950s. But I always like to tell people that I grew up with King Lear, my dad. My dad could curse like Lear. You know how Lear has this amazing ability to curse. I brought one here where Lear would say when he gets really mad at his daughters, he would say, let me find this one. It's one of my favorites. Well, he basically says, into her womb convey sterility. May she create a child of spleen. Terrible things to say to your daughter. Another character says to another one, I'll so carbonado your shanks. Without even knowing what it is, that sounds unpleasant to have your shanks carbonadoed. But this is the world of Lear, and my dad had this ability to curse in his own Calabrian dialect. He would say things like, "Te vo bruciare l'erba," which means, may the ground beneath you combust. He would say, when I wrote a little piece about it, my sister wrote me, said, you forgot when he used to say, "Te vo scippare la faccia in cane," may a dog rip your face off. He said these with love, believe it or not. But these were Lear-like curses. And, growing up in an Italian home, English was sort of like, I was learning English in school, but it was kind of like a foreign language. And that's where Shakespeare really entered into my soul, if you can say. There's a speech that Othello gives that is so brilliant and beautiful. It's when and this is before his downfall, before they ask him for that, before he becomes obsessed with ocular proof. And this is when he tells the people how Desdemona fell in love with him. And it's a magnificent speech, because they're basically saying, Desdemona is the most eligible woman in Venice. If there were a show Bachelorette back then, she would be the star of it. And yet she marries Othello, who's a Moor, who's older. Why? And this is what Othello says. Her father oft questioned me, invited me, questioned the story of my life. From year to year, the battles, the sieges, and fortunes that have passed, I ran it through from my boyish days, of moving accidents by flood and field, of hairbreadth escapes in the imminent foe's deadly breach. These things to hear would Desdemona seriously incline. You can just imagine her craning her neck forward. And then he says, she loved me for the dangers I had passed, and I loved her that she did pity them. That is the only witchcraft I used. To me, this is the ultimate example of how Shakespeare destroys prejudice by saying, if you just hear someone's story, you'll never think of them as another. You'll see your common connection. Unfortunately, Othello loses that capacity when his mad rage to get that ocular proof. But here he's at his most human, and Shakespeare's at his very best. And I think this is what makes Shakespeare such essential reading for us today. You know, I mentioned W.B. Du Bois, who talked about the veil. W. Du Bois was the first black American to get a PhD in the United States at Harvard. He was a professor of anthropology at Harvard. He wrote a beautiful book called The Souls of Black Folk. And he had an argument with Booker T. Washington about the kind of education that former slaves should get. And Booker T. Washington made a very cogent argument saying they need economic self-sufficiency. Learn trades, that's the way to advance. And W.B. Du Bois said, yes, I understand that, but you know what? Until white people and black people get the same education, we will always have a divided society. Black Americans should get the same liberal arts education as white Americans. And he said, for proof of that, when I open these books, whether it's Plato, and yes, I sit with Shakespeare, and he winces not. Shakespeare doesn't care what color my skin is. So for W. Du Bois, Shakespeare became a ticket to that kind of humanizing experience that he felt all Americans should have. And I have to say, you know, way back in the day, I first sat with Shakespeare, and that's when I fell in love with English and with literature. And with that, I will say, exeunt omnes. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions from anyone. Thank you so much for listening. And I'm so glad I was worried this hall, I thought it was going to seem more cavernous than it is. It actually looks well peopled. So thank you for coming. Please. Yes. Oh, yes, go ahead.
Yes. So earlier you were mentioning Aristotle and poetry versus history.
Yes.
And it reminded me a lot of Sir Philip Sidney and his defense of poesy, where he actually mentions how history and philosophy would be nothing without poetry. They are very much reliant on
Because of the finer spirit, right? That's the phrase. Sir Philip Sidney's very important defense of poetry during the Renaissance, you know, it picks up on some of the ideas that, thank you very much. The question is, you know, Sir Philip Sidney goes back to that Aristotelian defense of poetry and goes a step further by saying, without poetry, philosophy and history would be bereft. Because what poetry does is it's the beautiful expressive use of language. So in a sense, it sort of packages the cognitive discoveries of the past in a way that makes people able to access them and process them. I totally agree with that. And, you know, I think that's, we would call that a sort of defense on formal grounds of the power of literature. What I think is that Aristotle goes even deeper by saying there's a kind of intellectual need that we have for it. It's not just the beauty of language, the aesthetic experience of it, which is so important, but he's saying this is a cognitive tool, something we can think with, we can sort of work out problems with. And I think that's what Hamlet figures out when he really needs to. It's like he's looking for an answer to a problem that he cannot solve. He's tried rational means, he's interviewed people, he's observed them, it's like he performs this work of art. And in that laboratory of the unreal, that's when he has his proof. That same proof that was denied to Lear and Othello because they were looking in the wrong places for it. So what I would say, building on Sir Philip Sidney, is that Hamlet has a very well-developed aesthetic sense, and he's aware of the power of language and the power of art, that he understands that breadth and finer spirit that Sidney is discussing. So thank you very much. Excellent. Yes?
I'm fascinated by the idea that the ocular proof that Hamlet needs is coming through the theatrics that he helps to set up. But he's very convinced by this and watching the audience's reaction. I was curious on your thoughts, though, of the fact that he doesn't accept the ocular proof of his own dad showing up and saying.
Yeah, I think in a way, if he did, that would put him with Lear and Othello. That's something, the world has presented you with, could very well be evidence, but Hamlet the aesthete wants to take it a step further and sort of, question just circumstantial evidence. Because, a ghost showing up, how sturdy a foundation is that for your claim? Because that I think in that regard, Hamlet is wise to kind of look for more than a ghost. So, but yeah, that's a really good.
Sturdiest, but it's not the theatrics.
Exactly.
Much sturdier.
Much sturdier. Yeah, that's a good point, though. I'm going to keep that in mind. Thank you. Thank you. Any other questions or thoughts? I'd love to hear from you. Yes, please.
This is not really a formulated question. It's sort of like fumbling in the dark here. But, I'm somebody who just started ago from my apartment, and I almost have this feeling like, whoa, I wasted my life. Nothing to do with Murray State. Everything to do with what's going on around us and the Kentucky State legislature and a number of other legislatures and humanities being praised these days. And I kind of have this feeling that maybe Shakespeare can save us all because he's that both conservatives and liberals sort of agree on, people want to have some connection with Shakespeare. And I'm not a Shakespearean at all, although not Shakespeare.
Yeah.
But I got told I had and they didn't want to fuck him, so I got pulled into little Shakespeare infusion at Murray Elementary and all that. I mean, I think people have positive feelings about that sort of thing. But I guess I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts at all about Shakespeare being able to help us do this.
Yeah.
And I think maybe what sparked the question is thinking about talking on PBS a few weeks ago about how he's going back.
Who said this? Oh, Hugh Bonneville. Yeah. Yeah. So I think it's a really excellent question, and it's one I've thought a lot about. I'm a humanities professor. I'm a professor of literature. I also teach. We have a first-year seminar. It's kind of like a great books program that I teach in every year, and I co-directed that for a while. So I'm very invested in the question, how do we reanimate the humanities? My take, and this is just my view from the trenches, as it were, I think that we have made a big mistake in the humanities in that we have this thing that people love. I think people really love Shakespeare. I think they love Dante. I think they love Homer. I think they love W.B. Du Bois. I think they love Toni Morrison. I think they love John Milton. And we've stopped teaching them because we've tried to find ways of making ourselves more relevant and more this and more that, whereas if we really just got students and the public excited about these great books, I think the humanities would be flourishing. because I do a lot of speaking, and I'm amazed by how excited people are to read these books, and how thrilling they find them, and how energizing they find them. And I really think that if we double down in the Academy and said we have a treasure chest to offer society, that people would respond to it. But it's not happening, and I don't know what the future holds. I mean, it's a tough time in the humanities. Shakespeare, you can graduate from many higher ed programs with a literature degree and not read Shakespeare now. And I think it's great that we've opened up the canon. That is absolutely necessary. But I don't think we should throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think we can have the best of both worlds. That there's these authors that really bring people together. These authors that really speak to students. And if we're excited about them, I think the public and the students would be as well. So your question is a very powerful one, and I think about it all the time. So thank you. Any other questions? Yes, please. So the question is, the question to be or not to be is generally thought as Hamlet's considering suicide, right? And you're saying your teacher disagrees, and what does she think? It's philosophizing. Well, I don't want to say anything against your teacher, but I think he's pretty depressed, actually. I think that it's okay. This is to the spirit of that question earlier just now about how Shakespeare is so relevant to the world today. I created this book club, and one of the books that we read was Hamnet. Some of you may have read it. It's a very entertaining book. It's by Maggie O'Farrell, Hamnet. It's not a scholarly book, and she makes stuff up, like tons of stuff. She makes up this fairy tale marriage between Shakespeare and his wife that they didn't have, because in his will, he gave her his second best bed, which isn't the most romantic thing in the world to do. It's by all accounts, what little we know about Shakespeare's domestic life, it doesn't seem that it was like the happiest of marriages. But anyway, the book is really interesting because it's fictional, right? And it's make-believe, but she has a thesis, and her thesis is this. Shakespeare has a son named Hamnet, okay? Hamnet dies, okay? Now, Shakespeare didn't leave a lot of stuff. This is why people speculate. He didn't leave a lot of stuff in his own hand. We don't really know what Shakespeare's reaction to his son's death was, okay? But Maggie O'Farrell's like, come on, it really affected him. Of course it did. And she constructs this elaborate make-believe grief of Shakespeare for this son, Hamnet. And Hamnet is just an alternate spelling of Hamlet. It's like you may have a friend named Isabel, and sometimes it's spelled E-L-L-E and sometimes L. Hamnet, Hamlet, believe it or not, were common names, alternate spelling, so the same name. And I read this book, and there's this really powerful scene when Hamlet is performed for the first time, and the make-believe wife goes and sees it. And it's all made up. It's not real. But I think she got something. I think she understood that is a play about grief. If you read the opening Act 1, when Hamlet comes on the stage and he's really grieving, when you hear that rhetoric of incest, my sometime sister, now my queen, my nephew and my son, and Hamlet's a little more than kin and less than kind. There's an atmosphere of grief in that play that I think Maggie O'Farrell absolutely nailed. in spirit, not in letter, but in spirit. And that's why I think that is a very heavy monologue. I do think he's contemplating suicide. It's a speculation, who knows? But I think there's a serious undercurrent of terrible grief in that play. And I think it has, how can you name a play about a son that you've lost and not and have it just be a coincidence? It's not a coincidence, you know? It's something, And it's Shakespeare's greatest play. And it's also at the beginning of Shakespeare's great decade. You know, the more I study literature, the more I think that increasingly writers are forged in a crisis moment. You know, you think of Dostoevsky, I mentioned him earlier. When he was in his 20s, an unknown writer, he'd written one book, he was a social realist writer, he was arrested and he was taken out to be executed. It was a fake execution. The Tsar had it all staged. And at the last minute, a horse with a white flag came running up. And he was sent to Siberia for 4 years. His writing changed after that. He became obsessed with theology, understandably, with why is there evil in the world. Charles Dickens, when he's 12 years old, his entire family gets sent to prison, goes to a debtor's prison. Dickens is living on his own, working in a shoe polish factory. He becomes obsessed with not being poor and works his whole life, arguably works himself to death, giving lectures, writing books. But there's those moments that just crystallize a writer, I think. And I think with Shakespeare, why you get those soliloquies in Hamlet is because there's something really powerfully deep and traumatic beneath them. And whether it's the grief over his son, well, the world will never know. But you read the lines and you can feel that there is something there that is very powerful. And that's why, you know, it's maybe the greatest play in the history of English literature, maybe the greatest work in the history of English literature. So it's coming from somewhere. And it's forged in that crucible of grief, I think. So, sorry to, I'm going to respectfully disagree and say that it is about suicide. Just don't quote me. Any other questions? Thank you. These are wonderful questions. Great. Yes, one last question.
Building off of an earlier question, and you talked earlier about Shakespeare's language. I was actually teaching Scottish play earlier today to a group of 12th graders, and one of the questions that my student asked me, and the reason I remember the question so thoroughly is because of the language that he used, and he said, Mr. Fiveman, why are we reading this? Shakespeare's language is so whack.
Was that a compliment?
It's like, I don't know if it was a compliment. He was confused by the language. So I guess my question is how do we
It's a great question.
get young students encouraged to read more of these medieval texts
Yeah.
with modernizing the language?
It's an excellent question. It's one that I struggle with as a parent as well. I think something's happened, and this is not scientific, it's just an intuition. But I think one of the effects of technology has been students, younger people, have a very instrumental relationship to language because they've processed language so quickly their whole lives, in emails, in texts, in, you know, quick staccato, rapid communication, that a lot of us, when we were younger, we read. Like, I read Dickens in high school. I read Shakespeare in high school. The language was unusual. It was older, but it wasn't like weird or whack, as your student would say. Do you know what I mean? It wasn't like so bizarre. I think for students today, it really is bizarre. I do, because it's so not instrumental communicative language. It's like museum stuff you find in a museum. And I think it's harder to get younger students to pass that threshold of linguistic difference than maybe it was for us 20, 30 years ago. So it's a challenge. It's a challenge. What I tell my students is, it's like learning a foreign language. You know, you have to, you'll get it. Once you get past the these and the thous, Shakespeare is actually not difficult at all. Some writers are really difficult, like Milton, Chaucer, et cetera, et cetera. But Shakespeare, even like with Jane Austen, it's hard for students. It's, the language is a barrier to entry. It's so not their world of rapid communication. So I think I do think it's a challenge. I think the technology, the drift of technology has made it even more of a challenge. But you know, once they do, the rewards, I tell my students, the rewards are all in the original language. You can watch the movies, you can read the paraphrases. You will not get the rewards unless you go to the original language. So it is a challenge, but it's one we have to really stand by really hard. That's a great question. Thank you. Yes?
But weren't the plays intended to be performed rather than read? There's a big difference.
I agree. I do think when it comes to literature, there's like the intention and then the reality. Of course, it's great. See as many Shakespeare plays as you can in a lifetime, and you won't go wrong. I also do think we can read them. I think they've been around for a few hundred years. They are texts, they're works of literature, and we can process them both as plays and as literary texts at this point. And if you're going to read a literary text, I think Shakespeare's a really good one to read. So I don't think it's an either or. I think, you know, you have both of them. I'm not of the school, some people say, you only meant to see them performed, you shouldn't read them. I disagree, because I think there's, you know, the reality is they've existed now as works of literature, and they have been read, they've been studied, we've come to understand them as both, you know, he's got a double life. He's performed on the stage, and he also lives in the libraries, and so we should celebrate that duality, I think. Thank you. Okay, I don't see any more hands.
Can you all join me in thanking?
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you.